So do your flicks and target switches look like this yet? Not to worry. We're going to be answering all your burning questions from watching the flick target switching video. And if you haven't watched it yet, go back and check it out. And if you're new to the series, we're going through each of the 6 major aim mechanics and talking about how you can improve in FPS games using kovaaks or Aimlab aim trainers. So let's jump right into the questions. So the first one is more of a general question, but are you still using a sends randomizer for practice? I get asked this a lot, and I think as a randomizer is useful earlier on in your aim training when you're creating a lot of errors and basically learning specifically through creating errors. I've been actually learning a lot about how the human brain works. I'm going to make a video on this in the future, but early on in your skill learning, you want to just be creating as many errors as possible in a dense amount of time. Randomizers can kind of help raise the skill ceiling there. You just want to avoid, getting too frustrated to the point where you walk away. It's very important that you keep training when you are frustrated so that you reinforce the concept of improvement being associated with frustration so that your brain can kind of like reshape itself based on what you're learning. So randomizers help with that. They specifically are most beneficial, I think, in reactivity tracking, which we'll talk about in another video. A non-topic question, but it's the best top 3 reactivity plays for beginners and intermediate players. Reactivity is probably the hardest aim mechanic, especially for newer players. There's no real secret to approaching reactivity. We'll talk about it when I get to reactivity tracking, but I would say early on, one of the best scenarios that you can practice that's kind of on the bridge between smooth tracking and reactivity is smooth thin strafes. And if you're playing Aimlab, I think it's called needle track strafe. Air Angelic is another great one to help with learning reactivity in a smooth way. Those are the 2 scenarios that I would really recommend playing early on. There's no real playlists that I would suggest for reactivity tracking until you get better at it. So curious on my thoughts for training on a higher sends to develop mouse control, even double your sends. Yeah, this is super common. Most great aimers that I've seen, like PhorHead, I think that's how it's pronounced. I've been pronouncing it Torj, sorry. He trains around 30 cm and plays at a lower sensitivity in Apex. I think he's like Nova Complete or something now. One of many, many examples. There's tons of great aimers out there that play on a higher sensitivity, basically because you're just raising your skill ceiling. Like you're raising the challenge, which, as I mentioned before, is creating errors so that you can improve. Like if you're playing aim training to improve and not just to kind of like hone your existing skill or to warm up or something, then you want to be creating errors so that you can just constantly be improving until you hit like some cap that I don't think anybody's hit yet. There's no real, you'll probably read some Twitter posts from like Aimer7, or you'll see it on Reddit about like specifically training at double your sends. There's no rule. Like it doesn't matter if you're specifically double or like 1.5. I mean, just basically increase your sensitivity if you want to increase the difficulty. Is a stable frame rate more important than frames? If you're experiencing micro stuttering and it's noticeably affecting you, like unable to track targets or see what's going on because of it, then yeah, you probably should stabilize your frame rate, but generally less input lag. One of the easiest ways to reduce your input lag is to get more frames if possible. Generally, you want to be getting more frames. Some games are poorly optimized, like Apex Legends is infamous for this. I don't know if they fixed it yet, but most people cap their frames around 180 FPS, even if they can go way higher just because they get micro stutters. Oh, and a follow-up question, if for some reason you have to cap your frames in aim trainers but play at a different frame rate in your FPS game, is it a big difference? I would say no. I mean, I think people overemphasize the importance that frame rate has like on your aim. I think NVIDIA actually just did this weird little latency test, and it does definitely, input lag definitely affects your ability to move your mouse. If it's like so noticeable where you move your mouse, half a second later you see it move, okay, that's really bad, you know, but generally the difference between 60 FPS and 120 FPS, it's not going to be that major. I'm curious what you're going to say good precise tracking, the common advice is just track better. I mean, you see a lot of like move hand fast, like just generic advice in the aim community, like just do better, be better, bro. There's more to it than that. There definitely is a case to be made though, that I would say some people really overanalyze every single nuance of what they should be doing when aim training, when really they just need to get more reps in. When you're early on in your aim improvement, sub like 200 hours aim training, I mean, just as a general point of view, if you have tens of thousands of hours in FPS first, then obviously that won't apply to you. You haven't been aim training a lot. You need to just practice the scenarios. There's no magic to improvement when you're learning a skill other than getting reps in. Like that's a big part of learning how to improve. Any advice on improving stability while applying the Bartos method, which is, one fast flick and then a micro adjustment? One of the more important things to focus on as you get really good at flicking and you get a lot better at micro flicks and speed, you need to emphasize your stopping power, and you need to ensure your technique one where you aren't having to tense up in order to stop. Like you should be prioritizing under flicking, confidently stopping on the target and stopping resolutely, I think, as Gored puts it. Great advice, great word to describe that. And then as you're practicing in this method and you're consciously thinking about it, your stopping power is going to improve and your stability is going to improve. So one of the biggest reasons that I see that people lack stability when they're flicking is because they're overemphasizing the speed when they're moving their mouse, and they're not emphasizing enough on the technique when they're stopping. I actually found not holding M1 to be a good exercise. I think referring to the fact that most people in target switching scenarios hold down mouse 1 for the whole time. I know of a lot of people that actually have a hard time with holding down mouse 1 the whole time. There's certainly a lot of scenarios in game where you aren't going to hold down mouse 1 when you're going between targets. So there's no major downside to not doing it, but I would definitely at least spend some time holding down mouse 1 to develop that technique. How do you make the targets glow? Like in some parts of the video, I covered that in the description. You can go to the Twitter post where you can do that in kovaaks. Did you know a texture for floor and walls that I can use for all scenarios? Changing them is annoyingly inconvenient. Yeah, it kind of sucks. I just kind of keep pure color almost all the time unless I'm specifically doing a ton of tracking. So you can just do that. It's just an optimization thing. It's not going to hurt you if you keep pure color on everything. Is the way they count scores in Aimlab the same? That's a great question, because I talked about in Flick TS and also in dynamic clicking all the different types of scoring and how to optimize the scoring. As far as I can tell in Aimlab, there's only one flat scoring method. It's either penalizing you on accuracy linearly or it's not. I think that's all there is to it. There's no weird like square root accuracy or anything. You should make a video on our sends randomizer. I already did, and I linked it. How have I been doing as of recent? I've been doing well. Thank you for asking. I have been, during the holidays, it's always chaotic. Finding a lot more free time right now. I've been trying to change my setup, get good setup going, get my office straight. Nerdy things. We just got a video 2 weeks ago. Is something wrong? Ha. Yeah, I know. I'm trying to make more content for you, the viewer. Okay, now a little bonus for the people that commented on my community post where I was talking about the progress I made on the next video, which at this point is probably about 80% done. I'm gonna go through the questions here. First one being, care to elaborate on grip, pressure, and tension in hands affecting aim? Okay, so there's two main things I want to talk about with this question. It's very important that you understand that your arm, your hand, your wrist, your shoulder is a complex instrument, essentially, that is attached to your body. It has muscles, it has nerves. It's very easy to overlook the importance of stretching, of treating your body correctly. When I was a lot younger, I didn't put as much emphasis on stretching and taking care of myself. I started to get RSI, repetitive strain injury, just because I was always on the computer. I was part of kind of like the first generation of children that grew up around PCs, and there isn't as much information as there is now on like proper posture and, good equipment, like good chairs, for example, like standing standing desks. Those weren't a thing. The most important thing that you need to manage when you're aim training and when you're playing FPS games is to not over grip your mouse. Like, people talk about tension and grip pressure in that context almost primarily for that reason, because you can give yourself more stability and more stopping power by tensing, you know, and by pushing down on the mouse pad, for example. But in the long run, that's not good for your health. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind. I mean, I'm not your dad. Do whatever you want, but just know that you could be putting yourself, like, if you want to be competitive, you want to be in the competitive scene long term, you could put yourself out of commission completely. And then your run's over. This happens all the time. People don't emphasize this enough. So it's just something that you really want to think about. I would very strongly suggest it. So the second thing is, it's actually better technique to think about stability, not in the context of making a strong mouse movement, and instead in a relaxed manner, kind of decelerating. If you're finding yourself needing to, after like a flick, for example, very concretely hold your mouse with tension, you need to reevaluate how you're approaching your technique, and you need to focus more on under flicking and focus more on kind of decelerating as you approach the bot. You know, actively think about your tension in your hand when you're doing this. And over time, it's going to improve, and you'll find it's actually a better technique to have, because eventually it becomes a bottleneck where if you're constantly you're over flicking and having to flick back, especially if a bot's moving or target's moving like this, you're gonna always be behind. You're just gonna fail to hit your target, especially when you start to get to reactive tracking. So it's just a good habit to get into. You elaborate more on stability after flicks, the way you would practice it. There's specific techniques you think are worth trying and implementing. So that's almost exclusively related to what I was just talking about. Actually, there's another question along the same lines. Really focus on Pokeball scenarios. And really focus on, when you're doing Pokeball scenarios, under flicking. Prioritize it. Think about it. Specifically Pokeball scenarios, I would say micro flick, like hip fire scenarios are good for this. Gored actually just released a routine on micro flicking, which has a lot of these types of scenarios. Also Bill, B-I-L, has a static playlist that he's refreshing every week or so. The latest one has a lot of Pokeball on it, which is good for this. And again, you have to think about under flicking and stopping on the target when you're playing, so that you're not just rotely going through the scenarios and the routine, but actively thinking about your technique while you're doing it. The initial flick and micro are great for stability but the stability after micro is really, really lacking. It causes delay or missed clicks when speed increases. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, is prioritizing your under flicks and prioritizing working on Pokeball. Like, you will develop that technique as you practice more and more. If you just hard push flicking scenarios and like get better and better at that without valuing Pokeball and without valuing under flicking, your stability is going to suffer. How to stay on target as soon as the bot switches directions. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the smooth tracking. It is related to accelerating and decelerating. It is related to not predicting. The biggest problem that most people have, especially when they're starting out, not reading the target, and they're not waiting for the bot to change directions before they try looking back to the target, and it causes them to kind of do one of these little numbers where they're like shaking their hand. It might seem like you're getting lower scores focusing on reading the target, because you're absolutely having to wait until it switches before you move back to it, but that's the right technique. Teach me the ways of ASRIM. I have no idea what that is. How to adjust onto target quickly, smoothly, and without going past the target. I feel like readjusting onto the target after it strays is difficult with fast and thin bots. A good point. I mean, it's related to what I was saying earlier, but with thinner bots, it becomes more and more noticeable. All right. You really will see where you're flicking past, and that's because you're really just flicking too fast. It's better, in my opinion, when a bot changes direction. Like if you're talking about a tracking thin bot, like say smooth thin strafes, it's better to kind of drag slightly behind the bot if you're smoothly adjusting to its changing direction. rather than flicking past it and then having to come back. And the reason for that is because once you start getting into reactive scenarios, or if you start getting into flicking target switch type scenarios or micro flick scenarios with lots of bots, all of those little micro corrections that you're having to make are going to add up to major score losses, and in game it's going to result in you getting bodied, just because if you're playing against somebody who's really good at strafing reactively and you can't keep up with them, like you're just going to lose a fight. Teaching yourself purposefully kind of smoothly reacting back to changes in direction instead of flicking past and then flicking back is a better technique to learn. How can you get fast, snappy aim without shaking? Is it just TS and static, or how can I achieve that type of aim? There's a lot of things that go into that. Like, I would say that that's very context dependent. One of the things is kind of purposefully playing at different sensitivities so that you can train different muscle groups, because I mean, your hand and your shoulder and your arm, like I said before, is muscles. So you do have to build up tiny, micro fibers that exist. Like, think about if you're doing weightlifting, instead of just sitting, like, let's say you want to bench, instead of just sitting there and like lifting the heaviest weight that you could possibly lift fast and with poor technique, you want to very slowly raise the bar and then very slowly let it come back down. And you're doing that so you can build up all the muscles around the major muscle groups that support it, So it's very similar in your aim training. A lot of your shakiness could be due to you not focusing on certain muscle groups that are in your hand, your wrist, your arm. Another one is, like I said, tension. Like, that's the number one thing that people assume when they talk about shakiness, shaky aim, is tension, is over gripping your mouse, like we talked about earlier. Could also just be because you're working on one sensitivity only certain types of scenarios that emphasize specific parts of your arm, and only those specific parts of your arm. So forcing yourself to use different parts of your arm, forcing yourself to use different parts of your pad that you're used than what you're used to, changing sensitivities, trying static on 20 cm instead of 50 or 60 cm, or vice versa. Just like moving around like that and being more dynamic about your training. Over time, you'll build up those muscle groups, and then you'll get better and you won't be as shaky. Incorporate Aimlabs into your videos, you will get wider reaching audiences. Yes, that is actually in my next video. I am going to be focusing very heavily on Aimlab, and I'm glad you brought that up, because Aimlab has really come a long way now. I didn't like it maybe 6 months ago. It was way too clunky. It's still kind of clunky, but they're slowly improving it. And really the biggest change that happened is that Reactivity, formerly known as Respectful Aim, built tons of great scenarios in Aimlab now. Like, you could just do a Control F in Aimlab and type RA and then look at all of the scenarios that they have. And one of the coolest things that kind of came out of it is, I mean, if you go to kovaaks, there's like tens of thousands of scenarios, right? But so what they did is they selected some of the best in breed that has evolved over the years in kovaaks and brought them into Aimlab. So it's a more focused group of some of the best scenarios that you can train on. So it's really cool. Definitely try Aimlab if you haven't tried it. Definitely run the Reactivity benchmarks if you haven't played them. So yeah, the next video, I'm going to be focusing a lot on both kovaaks and Aimlab if you don't have the money to play kovaaks or you don't want to pay for it. So that's all the questions. Be on the lookout for the smooth track vid coming out in the next couple weeks, I want to say. I mean, it is a holiday, so it might take me a little bit longer to put it out. Thanks for watching this. Hope you find this useful. Please keep commenting in the YouTube videos so that I can answer questions like this if you have questions, and I'll see you next time.